Now, Shakespeare's tragedies differed from the Greek tragedies in that they contain humor. He put in comic relief in his tragedies, which the Greeks did not. And the type of humor that he employed involved things like physical humor, the kind of thing that you get when somebody slips on a banana peel or gets a cream pie in the face. That's physical humor. And wit, puns and wordplay, and also comedy of character. And you can see all three of those in Romeo and Juliet. In the opening scene with Samson and Gregory, of course you can pick out probably the bits of pun and the other sort of jokes, some of them a little bit on the saucy side or the bawdy side or the crude side. But in addition to that, there's a lot of physical comedy there, and it's easy to miss because there's no stage directions. You can get a hint because as soon as they draw their swords, Benvolio calls them fools, and Tybalt calls them heartless hinds, which are suggesting that they're sort of common, cowardly, womanly kind of characters, and they're totally incompetent with a sword. And of course, this is likely true. Because we see them with swords and they're servants of the Capulet household, we might think that they are competent swordsmen. But if you think about where this play comes from, Shakespeare, as a young man, watched Commedia, which is an Italian type of comedy, which Shakespeare would have watched these touring troops coming through. And they were famous for a very specific kind of servant class character called zany. If you've heard the word zany before, it comes from the Commedia. And these characters were very, very physically active. And so you can imagine when they go to pull out their swords that there's a riot of, dropping their swords, of hitting each other by accident, poking each other in the bum with a sword, perhaps injuring themselves, and so forth. That's not immediately obvious. And as a modern director, one might choose to include that or not include that, but that certainly was the case in the way that Shakespeare was traditionally performed at the Globe Theatre. Samson and Gregory show you a little bit of pun and humor and wit, but my favorite bit of wit comes from Mercutio in his famous death scene when he takes on Tybalt and he's wounded. Romeo asks him, "Are you hurt?" And he goes, "Aye, a scratch. Marry, 'tis enough. 'Tis enough." What do you mean, 'tis enough? It is enough to kill him. And Romeo goes, "Oh, it's not really much." And he goes, "Oh, no, it's not as deep as a well or as wide as a church door, but 'twill serve. It will do the purpose that it was intended, and that is to kill me." Wonderful humor in the face of death. It creates a sense of nobility to this character, and it creates an incredible, poignant moment as we see this witty, intelligent, good-looking, talented young man cut down by this tragic mistake. Why is he fighting Tybalt to begin with? Because he knows that he's a much better swordsman than Romeo, and Romeo's head is somewhere else. He's thinking about love only. He's not worried about, he's not really concentrating on his game. So Mercutio jumps in, and then Romeo gets involved because he doesn't want him to fight, and so he doesn't want anybody to get hurt. And ironically, Mercutio is killed because Romeo tried to help him. And if that wasn't enough, is his final lines, he comes up with this really wonderful pun, and he says, "Ask for me tomorrow, and you shall find me a grave man." And I just think that's incredibly beautiful writing on the part of Shakespeare. Comedy, character, wonderful. And probably the last kind of character that I want to mention here is comedy of character, and I'm going to draw your attention to the nurse. Now, you probably know that the women's parts were usually played by boys, but the nurse wasn't played by a boy. It was played by a man. Not just any man, but probably a big, burly, tough guy, or, a seasoned comic actor, the kind of actor who would have played Falstaff in Henry IV, the kind, Shakespeare's most famous comic role. And when we first meet him or her, he makes this rather crude joke about. He makes this. He says, "By my maidenhood at 12 years old, I bet, betting on his maidenhood, his virginity at 12 years old. He lost his virginity at 12 years old, and he's betting on that. And yes, she's very crude, but she's also quite lovable, and she's not very attractive, as he points out. One of the second things that he mentions here is that he only has 4 teeth, and then goes on a little farther, and you've got this big, ugly, burly man, and he's talking just shortly after this about what it's like to breastfeed Juliet. Well, can you imagine? The groundlings are just rolling on the ground, peeing themselves over this kind of character who is lovable in the sense that she's very loyal to Juliet, and she's a bit crude. She does some physical humor too. She's not just about dirty jokes. When she goes off to see Romeo and she comes back with the news that Romeo wants to marry Juliet, Juliet is, of course, very anxious for the news, and she pretends, or he pretends, that he's out of breath and he can't answer. And then once he catches his breath, he's saying, "Did you have supper? Is your mother here?" And Juliet's pulling out her hair. And once he can see that the joke has gone a little bit too far and Juliet is genuinely upset, he gives her the information that he wants. And it's kind of a really good example of the kind of well-written comedy that you can find in Shakespeare's tragedy.